Hello and welcome to the Left Foot Forward YouTube channel. This is a new channel developed by myself and our guest today, Donal Lavery, talking all things political across the globe, but with a focus and emphasis on Irish politics and UK politics. And we will deviate sometimes to American politics when the time is right. Today, we're going to talk about the Noah Donohoe Scandal and the forthcoming book that Donal Lavery has coming out in the coming weeks. So I'm going to go through a series of questions on what led him to do so, and what piqued his interest in getting involved with such an important story. Obviously, you can tell that I am also from Belfast, but I live in the United States. I'm part of the business sector, but I do take a keen interest in all things political, right across the board from democracy right through to power dynamics. Donal, do you want to give a brief intro to anybody watching about yourself, and also about how you got involved with the Noah Donohoe case, and how you came about to starting this book?
Yes, of course, Anthony. Basically, I work in the financial sector, but I have been a local commentator for probably in excess of over 4 years now. In terms of this particular issue, I mean, we should point out that both of us are actually two North Belfast lads, born and bred. So that kind of focused our interest on the matter, and the fact that the mainstream media seemed to be overlooking it. By way of actually me developing an interest in it, it happened while I was convalescing from major surgery, when basically a family member come into the house and stated that they were going out to search for Noah Donohoe. And I asked them, Noah who? And then they explained the situation. I seen it on the news. And from then, really, everyone on a community-wide basis across North Belfast and afar started to become involved in the campaign to search and rescue operation to find Noah. And from that, there were certain peculiarities that I noticed, things that were unusual and that I thought that didn't really make sense. So I started to jot them down, and it struck me that when you look at previous cases, because both of us are actually the same age as Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, that there wasn't the same sort of effort and resources put into this, even when you accommodate for the pandemic, that those other precedent cases had essentially been afforded.
Why not?
Why not? I mean, that essentially, that and the overall police handling of it, I felt was very, very unusual. And also the fact that the young lad was found in a storm drain, I found that deeply disturbing. It was almost like something out of Stephen King's novel It. But that's basically what developed the interest in it.
And why is this important to the general public, especially those of North Belfast and just Belfast in general? But why is it important to them?
The welfare of children is everyone's business and important to everyone. I mean, everyone has a moral and social obligation to look after other people's children. But in terms of the actual public interest matter at hand here, there's a number of them. The first is the matter that essentially people have the right to regulate the police and to hold them to account for any issues of failing to conduct a proper protocol, and essentially garnering some degree of transparency from them. Also on top of that, I think the fact that the issue of the media more or less overlooking this, or failing to provide adequate coverage in a way that befits the young man, that also is something that I would certainly argue meets the public interest clause. On top of that, there has been a total lack of widespread political engagement and intervention in this. I mean, yes, there have been various figures who hold various offices that have made statements on it, but I don't see any real tangible evidence of intervention or, any anything by way of assistance in terms of the case. So really, that sort of when I look at all those factors combined, that's I actually composed a complaint to the police ombudsman just as a member of the public, who had went out on the searches, and that went viral, and it has resulted in a petition with over in excess of 57,000 signatures. I didn't set up the petition, but other people who read the complaint did, and I understand it stated in it that they were friends of Noah's mother. But essentially, when it comes to the public interest, that's a very loosely defined thing. It's not something that has a specific test, so to speak. I think the greatest measure of the public interest is the number of people who actually are interested in this matter. And, by and large, I think most parents, certainly in the north of Ireland, are engaged in the issue and are following it widely.
So what would you have liked to have seen done from both the police and the state in general?
As in done in terms of, I assume what you mean by that is done differently, yeah.
Yeah, done differently. What would be an ideal? What would have been a more ideal scenario in terms of their engagement with the public and in the conduction of their case?
Well, I think the first thing that would have been helpful would have been to have a widespread community consultation on the matter, which they lied to people and said that they had when it was found out they didn't have that. I think on top of that, there should have been a widespread information campaign. They told people that there had been a leaflet drop, which there had not been. They refused an information request from Noah's mother when she asked for that. That was reported on, I think, in the Irish News at the time. But one of the things, and I mentioned this in the book, that I regard as a pertinent and key aspect to this, is that by way of expert personnel, if you compare this to other cases, the police really dragged their heels in requesting the assistance of such people. I think that one of the things that really ought to have been done should have been a formal request made to the Dublin government for members of An Garda Síochána, who are specialist officers in locating the remains of what are termed the disappeared, essentially victims of the conflict who were buried across the Irish border. And essentially the Garda have expert trained personnel in locating bodies. I think that would have been one thing which would have certainly helped with a more speedy location of Noah. I think on top of that, I think generally that there wasn't really much by way of engagement from the PSNI with the widespread with the community, essentially with the community at large. I think on top of that, I think there was a lot of misinformation and disinformation that was quite unhelpful, particularly trying to run with this false narrative that they believed that Noah had suffered a head injury following a fall, which turned out to be completely false when the post-mortem occurred. So all in all, I think it was poorly handled. I mean, we could talk all day and all week about the things that they could have done differently, but I think the number of people who signed that petition, I think that really shows essentially that people don't have confidence in how it was handled, and that it has damaged confidence overall in policing in the north.
Well, just from my own perspective, some basic democratic principles of freedom of information, access to information, transparency from our elected leaders, and just people in power in general. So that's a big topic for me. But how do you feel the lack of transparency and the lack of implementation of the Freedom of Information Act has impacted this case?
Well, it's funny you say that, because one media outlet actually reported recently that the UK government had a secret unit in place which was really setting out to undermine the Freedom of Information Act and frustrate requests made to public bodies to establish transparency, and that has happened obviously during this whole affair. But I'm not saying that that's directly linked to it. Certainly, a lack of transparency and a refusal and rejection of freedom of information requests were things that were a great hurdle with me. I found that trying to get information out of the police was virtually impossible, because even when it came to submitting email requests for information, which, let's be honest, I mean, it doesn't cost a lot of money or resources to respond to those. They rejected those on grounds of cost. When it came to the ombudsman, I am still waiting from the ombudsman for a freedom of information request that was submitted to the ombudsman's office to have the legal advice from senior learned counsel, assuming they requested it, on the actual issue of the public interest clause that was stated in asking them to probe the police handling of the matter. They haven't released that. They did release some things. I mean, they were able to tell me, I think, that there are at least 12 former police personnel working within that office, policing the police, so to speak. But overall, the lack of transparency has added to the narrative of conspiracy theorists, of people who hold a wide range of speculation on the matter, which I'm not doing. I mean, I have explicitly stuck to the actual facts of it. So the coroner has ruled that people should not be speculating on it, particularly in terms of the social media activity. There was an awful lot of that going on at the time, and I do think it was distressful for the family to see some of that. However, this book itself is not a speculatory matter. I mean, it's something that very much sticks to that which can be factually proven, and where there is a statistical data behind. And I don't care much for my own opinion. I have to say that in writing this, I specifically structured it in a way whereby it's a short but hard-hitting book that focuses purely on fact, as opposed to any sort of narrative from me, so to speak. Because to be honest with you, what I think on the matter, really, it's not really that important. Who cares? At the end of the day, people want answers.
I agree. So talk to us about the actual book. What led you to write the book? It's the whole thing's taken on a bit of a life of its own, but how has it been writing a book? It's a pretty impressive endeavor at 29 years old. How has that whole affair been, and actually getting down, sitting at your desk and having to think all this through and put it on paper?
Well, when you're convalescing after surgery, you certainly have a bit of time to do things, but there were certainly a lot of late nights spent. We were fatigued and very, very frustrated at times, and depressed over it. You come under attack at times in relation to it. It was a lot of harassment and intimidation, but the motivating factor in terms of writing the book was Noah. In that, it struck me that it was crazy that here was a very promising 14-year-old young man whose whole life was ahead of him. It would have had a very promising career in medicine, and that had been taken away. Yet there had been very, very little media coverage, very, very little answers provided to the public. And I felt that someone had to step in and seek to do that. And I thought that it would be particularly helpful if it was someone from that actual locality where Noah went to school, and also where Noah died. So, I mean, in terms of writing the book, I think this is probably a pertinent thing that when my agent was in discussions with various publishers, one of them, who I'm not going to name, actually stated more or less that they didn't have any interest in Northern Irish issues. Even an issue with the gravity of this, by way of the disappearance and death of a child, I thought that in a way that was almost like a form of literary racism.
It's very reminiscent of the great book Manufacturing Consent. The media doesn't report the news; it reports what advertisers want to publish, what's going to get the most views for
Yes, I mean,
advertisers, nothing to do with the truth.
the thing with the media, you have selective reporting, and with the police you have selective enforcing. Selective enforcement is a big part of this book, and it details examples, precedents, various cases whereby you notice that there is a discrimination. A discretion has essentially been utilized in various cases, and that each citizen has not been treated equally before the law, which I think is something that if people don't point out and essentially don't pressure the government on, this is going to fester and continue. And another family at some point in time, perhaps not in exactly the same circumstances, but similar, are going to suffer this perpetual nightmare.
Just talking about other families, at least maybe a question about just what are the parallels between this case and other cases that you've taken an interest in or just have knowledge of? Because this isn't the first time the state's been negligent in its conduction of missing persons, any serious crimes, or
the one
anything of that nature.
The one that was certainly in the media recently, but when I say in the media, I mean I think it certainly didn't garner the attention that it deserved, was the case of young Shukri Abdi, who was a young Somalian refugee who essentially was living in England with her family, and the inquest into her death found that there had been no unlawful killing. There have been allegations of racism and discrimination from the family, and essentially what emerged was that with this particular child, who, like Noah, was from an ethnic minority background, but also wished to be a doctor, but she also drowned. I must point that out. But she had been threatened with physical violence by other children from that local area, I believe, who were not named. There were reporting restrictions placed on the case. And they had threatened to kill her if she did not get in the river, even though she specifically stated that she could not swim, and she expressed her reservations regarding that. During the inquest, the coroner in question actually accepted that the family had not even been provided with an adequate interpreter, never mind due process, in terms of their daughter's death, which I think that's horrendous, and even if I understand that, yes, they were refugees, and they may not, I'm not 100% sure, but they may not have had full UK citizenship. But under UN law, I don't think that that's compatible with international human rights. She should have had a full and comprehensive legal process behind her with the full assistance of the state. I mean, and I say that based on the fact that, again, the welfare of children is everyone's business. It should be irrespective of where they're from and so forth is irrelevant to the matter. I mean, upholding and safeguarding the rights of children is something which everyone has to be involved in, to prevent some of the horrors that have happened in the past. But in terms of other cases, I mean, perhaps of a more local nature, there was one the year that both of us were born, a young girl called Sonia Forsyth. Again, she was a teenager in Belfast. This happened in the Shankill Road area, whereby someone who was believed to be connected in some sense with paramilitaries, he had lured Sonia to his apartment and had bludgeoned her to death with a poker, and then buried her body in a carpet in the coal bunker of his house. And whenever the police actually, whenever they began investigating and questioning him, he actually firebombed the house, or the house was mysteriously firebombed all of a sudden, and he disappeared. It wasn't until 5 years later that another officer who was a bit more on the ball, he took over the case and essentially started to ask the hard questions, and eventually that particular individual was brought to justice, although he is released now, but the family certainly weren't released from their life sentence. I mean, they never got over that. And Sonia's mother stated that it had resulted in the premature death of her husband and other relatives. I would cite another case which is of particular importance, because I think it shows a selective enforcement on the part of the state, and that is that there was a young man who was also a teenager called Peter McBride, and this happened in 1992, the year after we were born, whereby Peter had been walking to the shop with a jug of milk, essentially to get a jug of milk, and was stopped and harassed by two soldiers in the UK Armed Forces, and feeling intimidated by them and the fact that they were being physically threatened, Peter made a run for it, and they shot him to death without any real warning. When he was unarmed, was in no possession of explosives or the means to detonate explosives, as some of them tried to allude to in the media. And essentially, it took 48 hours before the police were even allowed to question those soldiers. The MOD backed them to the hilt, and after they were given life sentences, they were reinstated back into the British Army after serving time for murder. They were released under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. I don't believe they should have been. I mean, essentially that wasn't a paramilitary killing. It was an unlawful killing by forces of the state against a civilian who had nothing to do with paramilitaries. But what the case showed essentially was a lack of transparency by way of, put the family through an enormous ordeal in terms of trying to get answers from UK government ministers. The Prime Minister at the time, Tony Blair, he wouldn't meet with Peter's mother, even as a father, as a parent, to look her in the eye and explain to her the entire circumstances of the case. She made the request that they would be dismissed from the armed forces, which he did have prerogative powers to do, and essentially they refused to do it. So, I mean, that showed that the UK is one of the few countries in the world which allows convicted murderers to serve in the armed forces. I think that's just an absolute moral disgrace.
It is a moral disgrace. Why is transparency so threatening to our model of government? Why is it a threat?
Well, I mean, discussion is a radical thing. Even what we're doing now. Through it, people learn ideas, adopt ideas. Without it, we would still be living under medieval kings and queens, where we would have no rights. And essentially, transparency is one of the things which maintains democracy. It is the whole a check and balance which the population and citizenry have over their government. The right to know what the government is doing in their name. I find that people in positions of power and authority don't like that, because it provides a mechanism of accountability for people to hold them to account. You'll find that popular public opinion has been shown to be able to produce change, even locally here. I mean, if you take the issue of the RHI scandal, which was a big thing, the allegations of corruption, and I must state that they were allegations at the time, and the public opinion, the shift in public opinion that followed them, put so much pressure on Martin McGuinness and Sinn Féin to the point that they did have to essentially pull out of the executive, and it collapsed the entire government. Because if there's a resignation of one of the first ministers, whether it's the first minister or deputy first minister, then the whole government collapses with it. And I have a feeling that if full transparency were to emerge in the case of Noah Donohoe, then there is certainly the potential that that would happen, because the death of a child, and certainly the disappearance in relation to this particular one, there was such a mysteriousness to it and lack of transparency from the authorities that people would be so appalled and disgusted at the mishandling of it that I feel that you would have a situation whereby direct rule would become inevitable. We would be in for a protracted period of direct rule. And I state in the book that there is, I think in a sense that is what may have to happen, that both the London and Dublin governments are going to have to, at some point, intervene to take over the running of this statelet, as had been done in the past, and bring in legislative changes which right-wing forces, you might say, in our own devolved government essentially resist. And I mean, I'm not just talking about issue. I mean, the Westminster Parliament imposed the abortion and same-sex marriage legislation on the north of Ireland because the Unionists kept vetoing it. And I mean, rightly so. Yes, I agree. I agree with that. Those changes needed to be made. But there are certainly other changes. I mean, relating to various different government departments that would also apply to. And at the end of the day, there's a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. I feel that at some point or other, power sharing may well collapse, and that it'll collapse on the rock of transparency. And the necessary changes which would need to happen for it to become workable will have to be introduced by a British government, and also under the pressure of a sovereign Dublin government. That's just my own view. But in terms of transparency overall, I think that if the public are paying through their taxes for the state sector, then they absolutely have a right in 99% of circumstances to know what the government is doing in their name. The only exception to that, the 1%, is that, well, in terms of national security, I mean, obviously you wouldn't release into the public domain if you knew there was going to be something like an attack by, say, for example, ISIS, because you want to catch the people who are involved and put them on trial. But other than that, I don't feel easy with people who use that excuse time after time after time, that it would damage national security or damage morale, you find, for certain information and transparency to be forthcoming within the public domain.
That's pretty universal across most governments. They always invoke national security as the reason for not giving forward information to
Yes,
be more transparent.
This pandemic, you'll find as well, it is being used to pass draconian legislation curtailing civil liberties. And that's not, I mean, I completely, as someone who has had COVID-19, coronavirus and pneumonia, I understand the danger of it. I mean, I'm certainly not doubting that. But you'll find that the government never wastes an opportunity to use a crisis to their advantage. And they are doing that in terms of the legislation that they're passing. Even some of Boris Johnson's backbenchers are actually rebelling on the matter. And those of a more libertarian view recognize the fact that this is a fundamental threat to freedom and democracy. Emergency legislation that is being passed, much of which was used in the past in cases like the Birmingham 6 and other miscarriages of justice, that is being driven through. Ministers are given what would have been termed previously Henry VIII prerogative powers to essentially pass laws in our name over which we have no control or influence. And I mean, really, you have to ask why. Why are people standing for this? I mean, I understand the fear surrounding the pandemic, but there has to be some element of democratic accountability and overall transparency by way of governance throughout. And I mean, even the way that the government boycotted Good Morning Britain, I think just that shows, their general attitude, that they have a selective approach to these things where they'll release into the public domain what they want people to know. And certainly in the case of Noah Donohoe, I think that there was an awful lot of, how would you put it, vague technicalities and loopholes that were played upon to refuse to disclose.
I just wanted to say something before I ask another question, but I want to apologize. I think I pronounced his surname incorrectly at the start of this call, so I'm going to apologize to everybody watching at home. So, moving on, if we looked at, I actually agree with you 100% on the draconian measures that the government are implementing during this during a crisis. In fact, there's actually a really good book on it if anyone wants to read it called The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. Talks about this type of stuff. In every crisis, there's always legislation pushed through. And it doesn't have to be that way. Like if we look at New Zealand didn't pass any new legislative changes to get the virus under control. And democracy was maintained, in my view, all the way through. You know, it was accountable to the public all the way through, and they've dealt with it. They didn't have to go through all of this crazy, draconian overreach, let's call it, in trying to get things.
There's I think in New Zealand, they have the benefit of having a very, very balanced, sensible, right-thinking female leader as prime minister, who happens to be far wiser, far more well-informed than many of the male counterparts that happen to run the world.
Yeah, I agree. Could I just ask a question around, I know it's a little bit, maybe sensitive in the sense that during the writing of this book and this whole case, you've come under quite a bit of attack and backlash, and I don't know why I'm smiling. It's not a funny issue, but I'm trying to be diplomatic about it, but it's been quite serious.
Yes. There's one particular, when you're writing anything, I mean, over the years, I have become accustomed to being insulted when writing about anything, because if you say one thing, there's going to be another side that disagree with you. I mean, that's the nature of the beast. But this particular case, in writing about it, I find that some of the people, one person in particular, who was making extremely defamatory and false and misleading allegations against me, because there was a face and a name to it, and also making unlawful disclosures about me by way of GDPR over social media and so forth. Normally, I would ignore stuff like that and would just take it in the chin. But in this particular instance, because it led to so much harassment, it led to so much online abuse, it led to intimidation and incitement, and my family members became particularly distressed by it. There's an ongoing police investigation into it. I have felt the need as well, because of that, to initiate high court libel and defamation proceedings against that particular individual. And I mean, the details of which will be forthcoming, I would imagine, in the media over time. The person in question is under investigation. I'm not going to name them, but I hope they're held to account for what they've done, because after the murder of Lyra McKee, I mean, I would have thought that people recognized here that when it comes to commentators and journalists, there really has to be, a limit as to how far you can go. And, I mean, providing, everyone has to accept criticism in some way, constructive criticism and feedback. There's no doubt about that. But there's a fine line between, constructive criticism and feedback, and actually going for the jugular personally, attacking someone, encouraging other people to harass them, intimidating them through the language that were used. People were saying they were going to put my windows in and so forth. And they completely misled others in relation to me by stating that I was profiting off of Noah Donohoe's death, when I have not made a single penny in relation to this. In fact, I have actually spent £1,500 of my own money in literary agents' fees to help produce the book. None of the media interviews that I've given, I haven't sought fees, I haven't been paid fees, and nor would I accept fees. So, I mean, while I'm accustomed to being criticized for writing about controversial things, I actually feel I've hit a new low for having good manners.
Oh, sorry, I don't know why I laughed. That's very true. It's almost a form of it's a suppression of freedom of speech.
I would go so far as to describe it. It's a form of emotional terrorism.
Yeah, it's if that type of behavior is condoned, then all you're doing from a just general democratic point of view is narrowing the discussion to be so small that nothing will ever change, nothing will ever get said from either side of the story. That you're really just again, it's maybe not deliberate and part of the intention, but you're upholding the status quo by not encouraging people to speak out on behalf of the public benefit and the public good. It's
In terms of this particular case, no one could really say that it's an exclusively private matter, because it was entirely a public matter in terms of the search and rescue operation to find Noah. There was a voluntary effort by the community and public put into that, and to raise awareness and information, certainly online as well. And on top of that, the community and public itself, they provided almost £70,000 in donations to a funeral fund for Noah, and have essentially become very active in the overall campaign regarding it. So, I do think all of that points to a public interest matter, particularly where state resources as well were used in the overall operation itself, which we all pay for and which we're all accountable for. It all happens in our name. So I really don't get this argument that people make that this is a private matter, when there are so many factors to it. You look at when it happened, particularly when there was a right-wing, racist, xenophobic era after in a Brexit-centric UK, when the Black Lives Matter movement was particularly prominent. It happened in an area that is renowned for right-wing extremism and hate crime. It's renowned for the use of state agents being involved in murder. I'll give you an example. Mark Haddock was a state agent who I believe was paid up to £80,000 and had been linked to in excess of a dozen murders. So, and that all happened within that particular locality. So anyone who would say that there's no overarching public interest in this particular issue, I just think they're wrong.
I would agree. And maybe on the last question here, what does you've mentioned the right-wing centric nature of the UK and Brexit going on at the moment. What role does ideology play in all of this, in terms of the model of government we've got, the just general implications of the shift to the right in general, in the UK, in the south of the border, and even across the globe, just in the United States where I live? What role does ideology play in this?
I think that the problem is that even from her grave, Mrs. Thatcher still runs the UK. And her neoliberal me, now, loads of money ideology of shrinking the state and essentially depleting resources for the public has contributed enormously to this, and also to the point where they're blaming many things on Johnny Foreigner, so to speak, and they're blaming people of colour on matters which have absolutely nothing to do with them. And if anything, Black people have far more to fear regarding white people, given the history of what we as white people have done to them. We were the people who benefited from the slave trade. We were the people who passed draconian legislation of a absolutely appalling nature and abuse of human rights, and yet people have the audacity to stand and try to give a respectability to that sort of worst gut instinct that I find. It's certainly a very prominent feature at the minute, and I think certainly the rise of Donald Trump contributed enormously to that. In the UK itself, there was certainly a left-wing democratic argument for leaving the European Union, but I do think an awful lot of that was actually, how would you put it, undermined by the underlying right-wing surge that was leading the Brexit campaign. Some of the people who are involved, look at some of the statements that Boris Johnson has made in the past. Referring to Muslim women as letterboxes, various other comments that are quite grisly, to be honest, and really not becoming any head of government. But when you take all of that into consideration, there is a shift to I mean, there has been a shift to the right. And I think that the pandemic, certainly in terms of emergency powers, has helped to facilitate that in a way. But if you ask me essentially what I think would be a solution to all of this in relation to this case, and this is what I do explore in the book while analysing all of those wider factors, analysing some of the prominent figures involved in this particular case. One of the things, I mean, if we're going to talk hypothetically, right, and you say to me, well, you know, what could the public and the Donohoe family, for example, do if they go through the inquest for talk's sake and they don't get the result that they want, or they feel that essentially it hasn't been as forthcoming as they would wish, they could go for a judicial review. And failing that, there would be, as I have stated in the book, the option of a Section 44 order of the Northern Ireland Act, whereby it could be turned into a public interest matter through direct representative democracy, whereby the MLAs who we do elect and we can remove can establish a committee of inquiry in relation to this. They can subpoena witnesses and evidence and records and question them under affirmation and oath, so that if they lie or mislead Parliament, they can be criminally prosecuted. That now, in an era when democracy is severely under attack, I think that that is a very, very precious option that people need to hold dear. I mean, that has been used before for various issues. Whether, I mean, RHI was a public inquiry, but I don't think that, you know, given the whole issue of how the Finucane family has been treated in their quest for a public inquiry, I don't think that the family will get a public inquiry in relation to Noah's death. But if there, I mean, if we were to talk about an alternative to that, which could certainly acquire answers, then it would be a Section 44 option before a Parliament which we do elect and can remove, despite all its flaws. And I mean, I don't want to name the person involved, but there is a particular loyalist who has been being prosecuted at the minute in a high-profile case because of issues relating to evidence which they gave as part of one of these committees into an investigation concerning a public interest matter. That's my take on it. But in terms of the overall book itself, I've given an introductory analysis of all of these wider societal and social factors. I've told people about the move to the right, the way that political winds are shifting. And I've laid that all out in the context of how a young 14-year-old man, I believe, found himself caught up in almost like a lion's den of these nefarious forces, dark forces at work in all of this, and how this family have been trapped in a perpetual nightmare in trying to get answers. So I've laid all of that out. I've highlighted the figures of intrigue and prominence in all of this. I've stated about precedent cases which are very, very similar and definitely have striking parallels to Noah's case. And I've also given them an ultimate solution to a very, very disturbing problem in a way which I think upholds both the public interest clause and actually shows an affirmative action by way of democracy and process. I mean, and it's something that it might not happen, but I at one point was going to give up on the book under the criticism was very upsetting and hurtful, and intimidation from that particular person that I mentioned and their followers. But what stopped me was quite a number of parents in North Belfast intervened and said to me, "No, Donal, we want you to finish this. We really need you to finish what you started, because we have a really deep underlying fear and concern in letting our children out to play, and we don't want anything like that, what happened to Noah, to happen again." Even, I'm not speculating as to what did happen, but there certainly is now a heightened culture of fear. There's a distrust in the police, and essentially there's a parental concern among families that if something like this can happen and a family can be left trapped in this sort of situation, then it's everyone's business to rectify and correct that. And that's what I hope to do essentially in writing the book. And I just hope, I mean, I'm not asking for anyone's money, in the sense that I don't have a publishing work myself to actually give it to everyone for free. You know, we live in the real world. I have ensured that it is priced as cheaply as possible. When it's available on Amazon, it will be $4.99 on Kindle and $9.99 as a paperback. I will make a donation to both the family's charity and also to the rescue service out of some of the proceeds of it. And on top of that, some of the money will be used in terms of the literary agents' fees that I had to pay. But what I will state is that I think that in reading this book, what people will find is that they live under really a bureaucracy rather than a democracy, where when they vote in an election, what they're really doing is voting for a management team, as opposed to adopting policies, changing policies, sacking men and women who adopt policies. Those sort of things, which men and women are in prison for around the world, men and women, especially in Ireland, have given their lives for throughout the centuries, to have the right to self-government and to have the right to know what's going on in their name. I think that all of that, when you take it as one and apply it to this particular case, there is an overwhelming argument for both the public interest clause to be strengthened and also for a more direct form of democracy therein. That's my view.
Well, I think I speak for many people when I want to say that I think it's commendable on many fronts what you've done and what you're continuing to do. I think it's the role of any responsible citizen, something I probably don't do myself, so don't do enough of. I'd certainly love to get more involved in helping certain things like this come to light, but I think we speak for many people. And I've done a wonderful job, and it's very commendable what you're doing. And I'd just like to finish. Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you for saying that. But what I would say is that I would hope that when the proceedings, the official proceedings, are over, that there are many commendable journalists out there and documentary filmmakers like Sonia Pulton. I would hope that we could garner sufficient support at some point to make a documentary out of this, because a lot of people don't really like reading books anymore. You know, it's not really their preferred option of garnering information. And I would hope that we could work together with others in producing a documentary of this particular case, and also what it highlights and lessons to be learned from it. I think there's always scope for that. And I mean, really, if everything has been above board, then what does anyone have to fear? I mean, the value of truth knows no price. And that's something that we all need to bear in mind throughout this.
I agree. I 100% agree with you. You've said it perfectly. So last point, have you got any final words on the book and any final words on what I think you've touched on a couple of times, but just as a reminder, what we should do as a local and national population in this particular scenario?
Well, in terms of the book, I've made it quite clear that while, you can talk about officialdom, whether it's coroners, judges, politicians, essentially those who hold high office, yes, they're in control of the official narrative. But the ultimate judge and jury in all of this, an arbitrator, is the public. And they'll ascertain as to how they believe that it's been handled. And in terms of what I think we could do in all of it, I mean, I certainly think that providing emotional support to the family is certainly one thing that I definitely mention. But I think probably the most crucial issue of all is raising awareness. Like I said, discussion is a radical thing. Having information, knowledge is power, so to speak. I think that if this is an issue which our elected representatives are not going to put on the agenda once official proceedings stop, but there are things they could actually do in the meantime. I think, but if it's something they're not going to put on the agenda, then I think the population should put it on the ballot box, and essentially, put the issue where it counts.
I agree.
And make it, if necessary, make it a political issue. There'll be upcoming elections, and I think it's something that there have been a number of politicians. I mean, Councillor Raymond Barr and Darian Strabane, he's an independent. He has done some good work on the issue. He's been very positive. But I think by and large, and I mean, bear in mind, I do speak. I am the grandson of a deputy mayor, so I do have some insight into the political atmosphere here. But by and large, I think that a lot of people don't really want to know about this issue. It's uncomfortable for them, and we need to break that stigma. We need to break down those barriers and make sure that this can't happen again. And I think even by having this discussion, we're doing that. And essentially, that's what I would encourage people to talk about the factors relating to this, the factors leading up to it, the factors following it, and also to draw lessons from it. That's my ultimate analysis.
Well spoken. Well spoken. I'm going to finish up here. I want to thank anybody who is going to watch this. It really means a lot to me, and I'm sure it means a lot to you too, Donal.
Yeah.
And I would also second what you say in terms of just doing anything you can to promote awareness of injustices. It's something I've came to later in life, and I probably should have done something more. And if anyone wants to even touch base on any of these subjects, you mentioned there, Donal, about bringing stuff to the ballot box. There's a great book by Eric Loomis who talks about any legislative changes or any major changes in Western history have always been pushed through by public demand. It's never been handed out as a gift by the status quo and the state. And if we want things to move in a direction that we're happy with in terms of democracy, holding people to account, having more transparency, then making it a political issue might be a really good way of moving things forward.
Yeah, I mean, even, I speak as a religious person myself, but I mean, I felt that there was almost like a theological parallel in this case, in the sense that almost as if Noah's final, I mentioned this in the book, as if his final journey on his bicycle was like Christ's journey to the cross, with his mother having to go looking for him. And that particular imagery, and people having known about it and said to me that they found it very moving in the poetry that I included in the book with it. I just have to say that I really do thank and commend the people of North Belfast and wider Belfast and afar who have got in contact with me personally and have supported me throughout all of this, particularly given the amount of harassment and threats received. At 29, I never expected that. I mean, you expect to take a certain amount of fire in anything, but I really have to say that some people have been absolutely fantastic and model citizens in terms of their support.
Well, that's very nice of you to say. And as I mentioned, I think we're going to tidy this up now. I'm going to stop the recording, but Donal, I want to thank you for making the time. I know it's late for you. It's relatively early for me, so I appreciate your time.
Okay. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you.